Okay,
Got a
70,
good
how about you
influx of yeah.
introduce Dr. Friedman?
Okay, for sure. Welcome to the Gentlemen's Assembly. Welcome to our very first AMA with David D. Freeman. He is an American economist, physicist, legal scholar, and anarcho-capitalist theorist. He is best known for his textbook writings on microeconomics and the libertarian theory of anarcho-capitalism, which is the subject of his most popular book, The Machinery of Freedom, which is conveniently included on our website. We greatly appreciate Dr. Friedman taking the time to join us for this exciting opportunity to expound upon the subject of anarcho-capitalism, as well as further elucidate any questions or concerns you may have regarding these socioeconomic systems. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's misleading to describe me as a physicist. It's true I have a doctorate in physics, but I haven't in fact done any physics since about 3 years after I got my doctorate. I was a postdoc at Columbia for 3 years, then switched fields. So I'm not, as I say, I'm not a physicist in the sense of somebody who actually does physics, and haven't been for something, close to 50 years. A little under 50
Interesting.
years.
You're very well versed.
Other than that, let's see. You left out the fact that I've written a few novels, which were not, however, enormously successful, although I'm fond of them. And I do historical recreation in the SCA. One of my hobbies is researching medieval cooking by finding recipes actually written down in the Middle Ages and cooking them. Lots of other things you could say, but if people are actually curious about me, my webpage has lots and lots of stuff.
All right. So then I suppose we should just get right into the questions?
Uh-huh.
All right, so you have criticized the legitimacy of the non-aggression principle using a number of hypotheticals. Are you aware that Walter Block has rejected these refutations using the continuum issue? If so, how do you respond to that?
The answer is, since I haven't read Walter's essay on the subject, I'm not in a position to respond. If somebody would like to summarize how the continuum principle tells us how you would go about deciding just what level of aggression does or doesn't count as absolutely forbidden, I would be happy to hear it.
Well, I'm not too sure we could get that right now, but I could send you his
You can,
article
but
afterwards.
I can't say that you're welcome to send it. I haven't found Walter's work all that interesting in the past, but he may have some good argument there. Well, we can see.
All right. Okay, I suppose we'll have to move on to the next question then. Do you think that it's possible that emerging market theory may come to take capitalism's place in the next few decades, or that capitalism might evolve into something unrecognizable as the status quo changes?
I don't know what emerging market theory means, and it's not clear how capitalism is defined. I can't think of any good reason why one shouldn't in the future have a working system of private property and trade, which is what I think of as capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how would a family or individuals that are used to getting by on welfare, how are they supposed to adjust to an anarcho-capitalist society?
Well, that would depend, assuming that they are capable of doing something productive by the people who are now on welfare getting a job. That in a society where you don't have the government keeping people from doing things by professional licensing of many sorts, where you don't have a minimum wage law making it illegal for low productivity people to take a job that anybody would actually offer them, I expect that there will be ways of doing that. Now, there may be some people who are, for some reason, completely unable to do anything productive, and I think they would have to depend on charity. I don't see any particular, but I think that would be a very, very small fraction of the people now on welfare.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I should say, I also think that that since I'm not in favor of introducing anarcho-capitalism instantly, that if you had a movement in which the government became smaller and smaller and interfered less and less, that the number of people on welfare would decrease over time. So by the time you got to anarcho-capitalism, I think it would be a much smaller problem than it looks now. But it's hard to know, obviously.
All right. As an economist, if there were simply one tax that you could abolish, which one would it be? Hello?
I don't think that's the kind of question on which I have anything useful to contribute. That different taxes have different disadvantages. I don't know enough about for any of the various taxes what would make one tax worse than another.
All right. Do you believe it is regulation or taxation that is a worse effect on the economy?
Probably regulation, but again, a lot of people seem to think of economists as people who study the economy, and that's not really what I do. Economics is a way of understanding behavior. I use it to understand a fair variety of things, but I don't spend my time studying the details of which tax collects how much money and what the deadweight burden is of different taxes and so forth. And there are people who do that, but that's not my kind of economics. That if you look at my books, none of them are about why is the GNP of the U.S. 5% higher or lower than it would be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Onan would like to ask the next question himself. Onan, can you unmute yourself, or if you can't, you may have to leave the call and join right back.
All right, very well. So what I watched one of your lectures at the what was it called? It was called the LibertyCon 2019. Do you remember that?
Sounds likely enough.
I guess so. So what really interested me there was the arguments you made on climate change. So I'll just read it off. In a lecture at LibertyCon 2019, you touched on the topic of climate change. One of your two primary arguments against anti-climate change actions was that the raised carbon concentration would be beneficial for photosynthesis, thereby increasing plant growth. Though we also need to take into account the effect that other changes, like changes in temperature, will most likely have on plant growth, this assumption that plant growth will be boosted has so far been included into the models of climate scientists. Very recently, in December of 2020, however, this assumption has been called into question by research that looked at the recent changes in CO2 concentration as well as the observable changes in plant growth. What was found was that the increase in plant growth has been far smaller than expected. The researchers attributed this to other limits of plant growth than CO2 concentration. This poses a problem since models have been using the assumption you made for quite a while now. Meanwhile, this research suggests that the models have overestimated the benefits of climate change since 1982. And since the graph of the growth function seems to slow off, this means that predictions for the future will be even further off into overestimation. To sum it up, looking at your conference, it appeared to me that you think that many climate scientists falsely estimate the consequences of climate change. And I think this is true. However, this now suggests that it's actually that they overestimated the positives, not the negatives. My request would then be for you to comment on this and also explain whether this changes your stance on government regulation in the interest of lowering greenhouse gas emissions, and if not that, if it at least motivates you to advocate for voluntary implementation of carbon emission reducing technology.
Are you talking about plant growth in general or crops?
This is on plant growth in general, so it would
I do
include
not
crops.
believe that anything that I said in any of my talks had to do with the overall greening of the planet. As far as I can tell, it is generally agreed that you get more plant growth due to more CO2.
Yes, exactly. That's what I read off.
That was not the point I was making. The point I was making was about crops. Crops do not have the same constraints as forests and grass and so forth, since they are generally provided with water and often with fertilizer as well by human beings. And the relevant question there is not what has happened to the overall growth of forests and grass and weeds and all sorts of other things. The question is, what is the effect of increasing CO2 on crop output? And for that, there have been many experiments over a long period of time with people pumping CO2 mostly into greenhouses, though I saw one paper some years back about an experiment done in the open air. I'm not quite sure how they kept the CO2 there, in China, I think. And those pretty consistently show that C3 plants increase their yield by about 30% with doubling CO2. C4 plants increase their yield by less than 30%. And that's the argument that I've been making, is that one large positive effect, which gets ignored in almost all of the public discussion — I can't swear to what all modelers do since I haven't read all of their models — but the fact that the projected increase in CO2 by about the end of the century would increase total crop production by something like 20 or 30% is a large positive effect. It is a much more certain effect than the various things that people argue will decrease crop production, which depend on whether or not there are droughts and whether or not these changes, whether or not farmers successfully shift their crops and so forth. But we've got one definite effect, which is a very large positive, and that's the point I've made. Whether your general point about their projections is right or wrong, I don't know. I'd have to look at what role general greening played in whose output. Can you point me at relevant bits of the IPCC report which actually report what that modeling is? Because I'm not familiar with that. Are there things in the IPCC report which discuss this, or are you repeating what you saw from some secondary source? And if so, can you point me at that so I can try tracing it back?
Onan, are you there? All right, I believe he is either just not responding or maybe having problems with the internet, so I'm just gonna...
Well, I have...
We may have to
my email is very easy to get. It is ddfr@daviddfriedman.com, and he is welcome to answer my questions there if he wishes.
All right, I'll send him the email after this is over. Okay, 7D, could you read that next question?
Very, very interesting. So, Gustav Mahler asks, "Hello, Mr. Friedman. First off, I'd like to..."
That's funny. I thought he was dead.
That user will appreciate you knowing who that is.
He says, "Hello, Mr. Friedman. First off, I'd like to admit that I'm not well versed on libertarian and anarcho-capitalist ideas, but I still have a question that I hope will be a good one. It is to my understanding that after reading some of your book, The Machinery of Freedom, that a typical market will have someone to supply someone's wants, so long as it's profitable. This assumption, along with the last tidbit, has left me with the conclusion that if a person were to catch a disease which is completely unique to them, there would be no doctor around to cure it. My thinking around this is that most of a healthcare market will be for basic cuts, bruises, and broken bones, etc., with another market of doctors competing for the more rare diseases, such as cancer, lymphoma, etc. But if someone were to get sick with a disease that only affects them, and this disease prevented them from working to the good extent needed to pay the high price to get a doctor or group of researchers to study it, would they then simply be left to die of it? I hope that I worded this question well enough, and I wish you a good day."
The answer is that whether in your rather implausible hypothetical, since I cannot think of any known cases of a disease that only affected one person, but if you imagine that happening, then if he could not afford to pay the costs of the research to find a cure for the disease, and if nobody else was generous or curious enough to fund such research, then he would not get his disease cured. And that does not strike me as particularly surprising, nor do I think it likely that if your imaginary case happened in our present society, that his disease would get cured, given that if you think about something like AIDS, there were a whole lot more than one person suffering from AIDS before it became the kind of issue that people were paying attention to.
Perfect. I would like to expound upon that just a little bit more as a personal question, if that is okay.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So, in that sense, then, would the principles of utilitarianism kind of fall into play more within this situation, kind of as opposed to what we would normally kind of view as kind of that kind of impossibility, right, of a hypothetical situation?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
It's a kind of an inquiry on like how much would the principles of utilitarianism kind of
apply where?
Apply within.
Are you talking about anarcho-capitalism or somebody who got a unique disease?
Yes, within the Mahler's question.
That is, if someone gets a unique disease, then I would think utilitarianism would probably suggest that it's not worth having 10 doctors and 20 medical researchers spend the next 10 years trying to cure it, since that cost is probably larger than the benefit. And I also think that, in fact, wouldn't happen, whether under anarcho-capitalism or under our present system.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
All right. Our next question is from Burgundian. Do you believe that corporatism has any benefits over socialism?
I don't know what corporatism means, so I can't answer.
Will it be fascist economics?
Oh, if you mean Mussolini's economics, I think the problem there is that socialism covers a great variety of different things. And Mussolini's approach is probably less bad than the full-scale central planning version of socialism where all decisions are made by the government, which has mostly not existed. It's, I think, a good deal worse than, say, the Yugoslav version of socialism, which was to a considerable extent, decentralized system based on worker co-ops, although with various forms of government intervention. So I think the answer would be that some versions of Mussolini's fascism would be worse than some versions of socialism and better than other versions of socialism. Neither corporatism nor certainly socialism is a clearly defined single object.
Okay. Do you have a rebuttal to historical materialism?
I'm afraid you'd have to tell me what historical.
The Marxist view of history.
I am certainly not an expert on Marxism. If the only claim is that the relationship to the means of that the technology of production has substantial effects on the economy, I think I would agree with that statement. So I don't think I have to rebut it, and you'd have to put in a lot more substance. And since I have not studied Marxist historical writing, I cannot tell you how much of it I would agree or disagree with.
All right, that's fair.
Let me tell you a story.
Okay.
About my father, not about me. When he was in Japan, quite a long time ago, in Japan there were two groups of economists, the Marxists and the moderns, who almost never talked to each other. And since he was curious, he managed to find one person who talked to both of them, who arranged for him to talk with one of the Marxists. And he asked the man to define what he meant by Marxist economics. And the answer, as best I remember, I can't give it exactly, but it was something like that the form of the relationship in the means of production is a major determinant of how a society turns out. And my father said, well, by that definition, I'm a Marxist, but I think that the arrangement of private property and trade and exchange is largely responsible for having free and democratic societies. So I think Marxism can mean an awful lot of things, and you have to specify a more precise theory before I can really answer the question.
All right. Next, X of Swords has a question. You can ask it. You may have to leave the call and join back to be able to ask it.
So this is actually a card in a fortune telling deck, I presume, or are you actually playing games with it? Anyway, continue with the question.
Um, First, it's a great honor to talk to you, Dr. Friedman. Yeah, first of all, yes, this is a card. This is a tarot card.
So,
Quite a long story, but doesn't matter. As an Israeli myself, I'd like to ask you a couple things. First of all, after the rising of more right-leaning, less socialistic-ish variants of economic policy proposals in here around the 70s and the 80s. Your father eventually came here and was criticized by the leftists around here and was gained more and more prominence around here. So I would like to ask you, what do you think of your father's influence in here in the past and currently? As I see it, it's currently rising among conservative and more libertarian areas of influence, and your take on the future of libertarianism in here. Thank you.
in Israel. I'm afraid those are questions for which you know much more than I do, since I don't read Hebrew, don't follow the Israeli press. My impression is that Israel has become less socialist over my lifetime, and that's, from my standpoint, obviously a good thing. And I expect my father had some influence on that, as he did in other places, but I really have no expertise on how much, and I don't know very much about internal Israeli politics, so I can't give you even any guess as to how much he was responsible for those changes, how much is a result of socialism working very badly. My impression is that New Zealand, which is one of the more striking cases where you moved away from socialism, it was done under the New Zealand Labour Party. I don't know if any of those people had read my father's work or influenced by it, but they were influenced by the fact that New Zealand was doing very badly and life was rather difficult due to enormous amounts of sort of socialist style overregulation. So I can't say whether the same things would have happened in Israel without my father as happened with him. I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question is from Bo Jiden. How did an anarcho-capitalist society deal with problems like child abuse and child neglect, as children are generally not considered to be in full ownership of themselves?
Yeah, the more relevant point, I think, is that children generally don't have the income with which to hire their own rights enforcement agency. And therefore, children in practice, in any system, including ours, are dependent on adults. If adults are going to have control over children, on the whole, the parents are a better gamble than any other adult, since the parents are the ones most likely to care about the children. I assume that under an anarcho-capitalist system, as under our present system, some children will get neglected, and some will probably get abused, but I don't see any reason to think there will be more. That, as far as I can tell, government, well, let me tell you two stories. One is a very small story. Back when I was teaching at Santa Clara University Law School, one of the people we interviewed as the possible hire was somebody who had been a law student at Cornell in Ithaca and had done various volunteering for helping poor people, for legal help to poor people. And I asked him the question of, in his experience, did the ability of the child protective people to take children away from their parents on net produce benefits or losses for the children? And he said he couldn't speak for the country as a whole, but where he was observing it, he thought it on net made children worse off. And now for the other story, which you can, with a little effort, actually check. As you may know, there was an incident in Texas, a couple of decades ago, where there was a fundamentalist Mormon group who bought land in Texas and set up their own, I don't know if you'd call it a commune, but something with hundreds of people in it. Someone in Texas law enforcement received a phone call which purported to be from a woman in that place who claimed she was a young woman forced to marry an older man. She wanted help. They sent in the police, basically, seized all the people there. The woman in question was not present and did not exist. It turned out, I think within a few days, that the call had been made by a woman who had no connection to the fundamentalist Mormons and had a past convictions for doing bogus phone calls. The Texas Child Protection Authorities took 300 children away from their parents, did so, held them for quite a long period of time, tried to get unsuccessfully to get some of the parents to admit that they had done terrible things, repeatedly lied about the facts. If you're curious, I discussed this in great detail in my blog when it was happening. It was very interesting. And eventually gave the children back to their parents only when first the appeals court and then the Supreme Court of Texas unanimously concluded they had no right to hold them. They were doing things such as announcing the number of pregnant minors they had and not explaining that a minor meant somebody they had decided was a minor because they were unwilling to accept documentary evidence of age. That two of the women they held, one I think was 21 and one was something like 24 or 25, were married women with a single husband who were pregnant, who they insisted were minors, and who they held until they had their babies so they could seize the babies. As far as I know, none of the people in the Texas Child Protection Authority ever went to jail or paid a fine for having used the excuse of protecting children in order to violate the rights of a whole bunch of people. So I think on the whole, government intervention in this direction is likely to do more damage than good. And I don't think you're going to have any society in which nothing goes badly for children, unfortunately, because children don't have the power, the ability, the income to make decisions for themselves, at least small children. Now, I would say that I think there is something, I argued actually in Machinery of Freedom, that older children should be free to run away from their parents if they want to, that you should have less government-supported authority of parents over children than we now do. But whether or not you do that, there is still going to be problems, unfortunately. Next question.
All right. Ironside would like to ask you his question himself. If Ironside, if you could leave the call and join back, you should be able to ask. Hello. Okay. We may just have to go on to another question. Ironside. We may have to.
I can answer one very quickly. Somebody wants to know whether about my favorite TV shows or movies or ones I would recommend. I don't watch television, so I have no opinion on the subject. And I have, I suppose, seen a few movies over the last 50 years or so, but I don't know that I'm in a, that I, having seen very few, I'm not really in a position to say which are the good ones.
Very interesting. One of our other admins are asking, what is your favorite ice cream flavor?
Probably one of the Baskin Robbins, maybe pralines and cream. That's certainly one of my favorites.
Okay, it seems we had a misunderstanding. Ironside did not wish to ask a question himself. So
all right.
We'll get to that one next. So
Yep.
Here, what are your thoughts on Henry George's beliefs in a land value tax?
It's an interesting idea. Of the things I think of as left libertarianism, it's the one I have most respect for, because it actually gives a specific argument and proposal. There are practical problems with it, that it requires that you succeed in measuring site value as distinct from the value due to things people have done with the land. In a sense, the best argument against it, maybe the best argument against it I know was made before Henry George wrote by an even more famous economist, namely David Ricardo. And Ricardo is responding to Adam Smith's argument for land taxes. The standard economic argument for a land tax, as you may know, is that the supply of land is in perfectly inelastic supply. That is to say, it's not being produced by people. And so taxing it doesn't reduce the amount of it that's there. And the one problem, the usual problem, is that while that is true of land in the sense of surface area of the earth, with the rare exception of landfill when you fill in shallow water or something, it is not true of the useful characteristics of land, whether it's cleared, whether it's fertilized, whether it's got buildings on it and such. Those are deterred by taxes. So you've got to somehow separate out what the land would be worth with no human inputs at all from what it is now worth. But Ricardo had a different argument. What Ricardo said is, if the source of income is taxes on land, then land will end up being owned not by the people who are best at using it productively, but the people who have the most political influence at getting the tax rate on their particular land low. So that he made what we would now call a public choice argument, and this was very early in the 19th century. And that is certainly a real problem, because you're going to have some institutions for judging what the site value is in order to set the tax, and those institutions are going to be affected politically like other institutions, and you're therefore going to have a large incentive for people to spend resources making sure that the tax evaluators are their friends. So that's one problem. Now, I should say, one of my friends and ex-colleagues, Nick Tiedemann, is, I think, a Georgist, or certainly very much interested in those ideas, and he's offered various interesting ideas on the subject. So if you want it, T. Nicholas Tiedemann, you could probably find him. I think his father was a prominent part of the Georgist movement at one time. Now, the other half, actually, Georgism really has two halves. One of them is the economic argument, and one of them is the moral philosophy argument, which basically says that since I didn't create the land, I don't have a right to keep people off of it. And the problem with that, I have a discussion of some of this in the third edition of Machinery of Freedom, if you're curious. And the problem with that is that not only do I not have the right to keep people off, we don't have the right to keep people off. So that the Georgist argument somehow assumes that although as an individual, not having produced the land, I don't own the land, somehow the government does own the land and give me permission to use it and exclude other people in exchange for my paying the land tax. But it seems to me, if you really follow out that argument seriously, the conclusion is that land should be a commons, that everybody should be able to go everywhere. That doesn't work very well for pretty obvious economic reasons, and that's a real problem. And as I say, I spend a chapter in Machinery of Freedom in third edition, and I can probably, with a little effort, find, I've webbed the late drafts of the additional chapters in the third edition, of which that's one. So if people don't want to spend $5 to buy the Kindle of the third edition of Machinery, they can find it there. And if you'll give me while we're doing this, I'll see if I can poke around and find that link. And if I have that link, people can read those chapters, one of which is on this subject. Next question.
All right. 7D, could you read Ironside's question?
Perfect. See, due to technical difficulties, Ironside is unfortunately unable to ask this question himself, and therefore administration will ask on his behalf. He asks, "Hello there, Dr. Friedman. I would like to hear your opinion and your take on the economic future of Turkey and libertarianism within Turkey, assuming you have heard of the Turkish lira crisis."
I have not heard of the Turkish lira crisis. I have heard a noticeable amount about the rise of Erdogan, and I know a little bit about the general background of the attempt of Ataturk to modernize Turkey, which was at least more successful than most of the attempts to modernize other parts of the Ottoman Empire, that is the Middle East. But I've been in Turkey once. Well, I've been in the airport more than once, but I visited Istanbul a very long time ago, and I liked it. I think my experience was that Istanbul had the best inexpensive food of any place I'd ever been. You can get good expensive food anywhere. So it's an interesting place, and of course the land walls are just amazing. But I just don't know enough about the internal information on Turkey to predict whether libertarianism is likely to rise in Turkey. I don't know if Turkey is going to end up as essentially a more or less Islamic fascist dictatorship, which seems to be what it's trending towards. I don't think it's going to end up back where it was sort of a sort of modern democracy guaranteed by the fact that the army will have a coup anytime someone tries to change it. So I don't think I know enough to answer your question. Although it's a very interesting question because it's a neat country and it's got an enormous history, of course, as we know.
All right. So the next question comes from Dad Praise Jesus. Do you think that cities owned by corporations would start losing legitimacy over the years as the children born into it aren't the original people who agreed to the contract? And along with this, do you consider it legitimate government if a corporation owned a military, took over land, and if not, then are still some circumstances which it could be legitimate?
I'm sorry. I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. You have a city which is formed by contract by the initial settlers, unanimous contract, and then what happens to the children? And we generally assume that parents own land and are not obligated to give it to their children if they don't want to, and that seems like a reasonable position. So if the parents owned the land, contracted to a set of rules, and basically agreed that people could only live on that land if they agreed to those rules, then it seems to me the children either are in the same position as everybody outside. They either agree to the rules or they leave.
All right. Do you think that communism is possible at all, at any extent, or is it just never going to work in any circumstance?
Depends what you mean by communism. I think that communism, in the literal sense of common ownership, not only is workable, it's a very common arrangement. It's a very common arrangement for very small groups, so that a lot of families are essentially communist. That is to say, generally, my wife and I don't pay my wife to cook dinner for me. And she doesn't pay me to do various things for her. So that's, in a sense, a two-person communist society, but we actually have two adult children living with us, and for most things, we don't arrange for market transactions. I actually have an ex-student of mine and his wife, who are both libertarian economists, ran their family on something much more like a market system, where the kids, instead of having an allowance, the kids got to bid to do chores. That is to say, how much they had to be paid to do a chore. And according to his wife's description of it, the kids would rent toys to each other. So that was a much more market arrangement than we used. I actually had a blog post on this quite a long time ago. People are curious. But as communism on a small scale works. How large a scale? There was in the 19th century, the Oneida Commune, which was several hundred people, and that was basically not only a communist system, but a group family. They were, in effect, all married to each other and, in fact, had sex with each other, which may seem weird to us in the 19th century, but in fact they did it, and they managed it for one generation, and it then fell apart. So I think there are certainly circumstances under which communism, not in the sense of central planning necessarily, but in the sense of common ownership, can work. But I think it's a system that scales very badly, that it's unstable at a few hundred, and works catastrophically badly beyond that.
All right. 7D, could you read Schizoid's question?
How do I put something on other than an answer to a question? I wanted to put up the link for the additional chapters.
Oh, all right. You could put that in AMA
questions.
questions.
This is a message to AMA questions, I guess, is the answer. Sorry,
I'm sorry?
not using Discord, but I think, does that work?
Mm-hmm.
That's the link, and it is one of those chapters is on the problem of how you justify property ownership, which is the underlying moral problem that Georgism comes out of.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you believe that a negative income tax could replace all forms of welfare, or do you have any criticisms of it?
I think a negative income tax could be replacing all forms of welfare would be an improvement. However, I don't think that the people who support the welfare would be willing to accept it because they would always be able to point at some particularly difficult case where somebody, for some reason needed a lot of money and the negative income tax didn't give it to him. On the other hand, I think that welfare as it exists works very badly, and that therefore a negative income tax would probably be an improvement. But in practice, of course, anything of that sort is likely to come in as a supplement to welfare, not as a replacement.
All right. Buchanan DM asked if your father was the first to teach you about economics, or if you learned it later in your life.
I think I learned a lot of it by conversation with my father. I never studied economics formally. When I became an assistant professor of economics at VPI, which was my first serious academic position, I think that Jim Buchanan, who more or less was running the department at the time, de facto, may have deliberately arranged to have me teach a very wide range of classes because teaching things is a good way of learning them. I certainly learned some economics from reading Ricardo and some economics from reading Marshall when I was teaching history of thought. But largely it was a matter of talking with my father and arguing with people and thinking things through and so forth.
All right. What are your main criticisms of the contemporary United States economy?
Main criticisms. That the government spends very large amounts of money, mostly in not very useful ways, that it restricts people in a lot of ways which make them poorer and more likely to die. For example, one of the more striking cases is that nobody seems to have noticed that it took about a week to produce the vaccines we're now using. It then took something like 10 months to get them approved. And while certainly you would not have wanted to have them on the next week being handed out to everybody, besides which they couldn't have produced them that fast. Absent government restrictions, I would guess that you could have gotten gotten to the point where anybody who wanted a vaccine was free to buy them, although there would still be very large limits for a while on how many were produced within a few months of the production, which hard to know, but I think probably would have saved a few 100,000 American lives. So the various forms of regulation, but especially of medical affairs, make us much worse off. Both the minimum wage law and a bunch of other restrictions on the employment market mean that a lot of people never get out of poverty. One of the sort of striking factoids, and it's hard to know how to interpret it, but it's worth noticing, is that if you look at the data on poverty, holding the definition constant, the fraction of the US population that was poor was falling pretty rapidly from the end of World War II, which is when the data more or less start, through the point at which the war on poverty got fully funded and staffed. And the fraction of the population in poverty since then has stayed about the same, going up and down with the economy. So that the original theory of the war on poverty was that it would make people not poor, and what it ended up doing was only making being poor a little less unpleasant.
All right.
Kept people poor.
Perfect. So our next question by our user, the Schizoid Man, he asks, despite the prisoner's dilemma in game theory, do you think there would be cooperation between private members to decrease competition in a free market? And if so, would you have any suggestions to combat this?
Yeah, I would have said that whether that happens is going to depend very much on the number of firms in the particular industry. That if you have 2 or 3 firms, then cartelization becomes a real possibility. And how practical it is depends largely on how easy it is for the firms to monitor cheating, for the firms to for one firm to know whether another firm is quietly selling stuff under the table at below the agreed on price in order to sell more. But I think that with very small numbers of firms, there's certainly a risk of cartelization. On the other hand, I think if you look at the real world American economy, you get a great deal more cartelization positively supported by government through regulation of various sorts than eliminated by government. So what do you do about it? Well, if you correctly perceive that there's a cartel holding up prices somewhere, you might see if you could start a firm that was competing with them. But that may not always be practical. If economies of scale are such that there's only room in the market for 2 or 3 firms, then you're quite likely to end up with those firms to some degree successfully conspiring. Fortunately, that's not the case in most industries.
All
and
right.
Of course, international free trade makes cartelization harder because it means you've got a larger market and therefore more players. So in a free market system, even if there is a U.S. cartel of automobile makers, say, we get to buy cheap cars from Japan or China or Korea or somewhere else.
All right, then. What main problems do you have with the Austrian School of Economics?
Part of the problem with that question is that people who call themselves Austrians vary a good deal. My main problem with what I think of as the hardcore Austrian position, the position as I understand it, that economics is entirely an a priori science rather than an empirical science, is that I do not believe, I can't think of any real world propositions that you can establish entirely on economic theory. That you can say economic theory suggests such and such will probably happen, but if one makes sufficiently odd assumptions about production functions or utility functions, you can generally predict very nearly anything. So I guess the way I put it in one of my books is, why am I standing on my head with holding a burning $1,000 bill between my toes? Because I want to stand on my head holding a burning $1,000 bill between my toes. That is to say, even though that looks like clearly irrational and economic behavior, you could always explain it by what my preferences are. So I think the right way of doing economics is to use the theory to form plausible conjectures, then find ways of testing those conjectures, and if it turns out that the tests don't support the conjectures, then modify your views accordingly. But nothing like all Austrians would actually hold that position, so it's hard to call that a disagreement with the Austrian school. I know that the Austrian business cycle theory disagrees, at least with my father's views, but I don't do macro, so although I'm inclined to suppose my father is probably right because I have a high opinion of him, I'm not really competent to hold an opinion on whether that's right or not.
All right. Do you believe that violence is a legitimate form of resistance against the state?
Yes, that is, it would depend on the circumstances. I think it's usually not a prudent form of resistance against the state. But I would say that if the state claims I have committed a murder which I know I didn't commit and is planning to arrest me and hang me, that I am entitled to use force to try to escape from the state and get away, which I guess is the question you're asking.
All right. TC1108 asks, is China's economy going to last in the long run?
Probably. I think the current ruler is a good deal less sensible than Deng was, and that the China may slide in a sort of fascist direction. On the other hand, it's a big country. It's got a lot of talented people. It's done very well as a result of abandoning socialism, even though it still pretends to be socialist. And I wouldn't be surprised if it continues to grow and become an increasingly functional economy. It'll do less well than it would do if the government was more sensible about leaving people alone. But
all right. Gladiator Central asks, what are your thoughts on anarcho-communism?
I think there may be more than one thing that goes under that name, but I think the fundamental problem that I see with the versions of left anarchism that I've looked at is the coordination problem. That is to say, what's the mechanism for making sure that the whoever is producing cars gets enough steel to make the cars that people want, and whoever is producing steel gets enough iron ore and coal and so forth. That doing anything requires coordinating enormous numbers of people. We have one workable way of doing that, which is private property and trade in a market society. And I haven't seen anything that looks like an explanation of how you do that in either anarcho-communism or anarcho-syndicalism, which are the two versions of left anarchy that I've encountered.
All right. You have said that you believe in an anarcho-capitalist society would not be very capable of defending itself with the military, and so it would need to get states to not invade it using economic incentives.
I don't think I've ever said that.
Oh.
I'm pretty sure, I don't know where that's coming from, but what I have said is that how to defend a anarcho-capitalist society is a hard problem, and I've discussed a number of imperfect ways in which you might solve it. But the ways that I've discussed are ways that involve getting an ordinary kind of military, but getting it without taxes, conscription, and so forth. And again, if you look at the link that I posted a little while ago, one of the chapters is called something like The Hard Problem Part 2, and it's about some speculation of ways you might be able to raise enough resources to defend the country.
All right. Sivan asks, if we were to start building an anarcho-capitalist society today, is it preferable to work with left-wing anarchists or with right-wing authoritarians?
I'm not sure what building an anarcho-capitalist society today means, and I don't think you really have to work with either. That one of the things that you could do to build an anarcho-capitalist society is to create market institutions that substitute for government institutions. For example, if someone worked out a successful low-cost way of running private schools that were substantially better than the public schools, that would shift us away from governments running the schools. That doesn't require cooperating with either. I mean, it will require cooperating with people who like the project, and some of the people who wanted to do such a project might be left-wingers, and some of them might be right-wingers, and lots of them might be centrists. But I don't think that I don't think the right way to think about it is that we are building a political movement to take over the country. Who should our allies be? It is rather we are spreading a set of ideas and creating institutions. And if you want to if you have libertarian ideas, you can spread them by writing letters to the editor, to newspapers that are left or right, doesn't much matter if they'll publish them. You can do it by having blogs. You can do it by becoming an academic and doing research that supports your position, you hope. There are lots of ways you can do it. So I don't really see it as a matter of forming coalitions, because we're not going to have the votes to abolish the government anytime soon, and that's not really the way to think of it.
All right. Mr. Bigman has a question. Bigman, if you could unmute yourself, or maybe you might have to leave the call and join back.
I'm here. Hello, Mr. Friedman. It's really nice to meet you. You had a good honor to be here. I went ahead and had a question. Do you think that the U.S. is going to continue to add more restrictions and press down more on our freedoms? Do you believe that some event will happen at some point in the future of U.S. history that will cause a revolution that will make people question the U.S. restrictions as well as their freedom?
I don't think those are the only two alternatives. I think that generally, at least in my lifetime, things are usually going in both directions at once. That on the one hand, it certainly was true for quite a while that socialism had lost its appeal. Now, I know the term socialism is very popular, but most of the people who say they're socialists in that sense aren't really thinking about, maybe some of them are thinking about the government taking over the auto industry and the groceries stores, but I think most of them are not. And I think that the the view that capitalism works badly and therefore socialism would be an improvement was popular when I was young and became much less popular over time, and that was progress. But to some degree, environmentalism has replaced socialism as an argument for governments doing things. And that's progress in one direction because it's actually a better argument than the socialist argument was. But in practice, it tends to support things, most of which shouldn't be done. So things are getting better and worse. And I really can't predict whether things will continue to get worse or whether they are going to shift and get better. I don't think a revolution is very likely, although it's not impossible. But changes in people's beliefs happen over time, and political changes happen over time. And I could imagine a future in which the Republican Party manages to keep the people who it got with Trump, but somehow abandon the worst parts of Trump's position, which were largely his personality anyway, and get back enough of the old Republican voters so that they're the majority party, and maybe they could then slide things in the right direction. My impression is that the Institute for Justice, which is a libertarian public interest law firm, has had quite a lot of success over the years in litigating in order to get rid of various unjustified government activities. So I can't predict that things are going to get either better or worse. And my guess is that some things will get better and some things will get worse.
All right. Someone asks, what are your major critiques of your father's political and economic views?
I don't have any critiques of his economic views. I don't think we disagreed on anything important, although there were things that he did that are not really of much interest to me. Politically, I think our main difference was that he was interested in making the world better by modifying current circumstances. And while I think that's a fine project, what I find intellectually interesting is more nearly figuring out how far you could carry the principles, trying to figure out whether you could go all the way to deregulating the entire country by eliminating the government. And I don't think that's really a disagreement. I thought that the system I proposed in machinery might not work, but probably would. He thought that it might work, but probably wouldn't. And that's not really a serious disagreement, since neither of us have sufficient basis to be confident of that.
Okay, we'll have one question that's a little non-political. What is it about Classic World of Warcraft that you like so much?
I don't like it so much. I've been playing almost none at the moment. I like it a good deal better than the current version of World of Warcraft, because as far as I could tell, what was happening with World of Warcraft was that it was shifting from being a game to being a story that your character got walked through. So that, for example, it was the case a while ago, probably around the point I dropped out of the standard World of Warcraft, that there were certain things you couldn't do, I think maybe flying in the new territories or something at some point, unless you went through certain quest lines, despite the fact that those quest lines might require you to do things that your character wouldn't do, given that your character, if you're actually thinking of it as a game where you're role-playing, has his own preferences and such. So I thought that it's not a very, the Blizzard is never very good at storytelling in my view, but the really neat thing about World of Warcraft is that human beings are much better at pretending to human beings than computers are. And so in World of Warcraft, you had a game where there were a whole bunch of people interacting. That was neat. It had a lot of interesting potential. And when they reintroduced Classic, I put eventually 3 characters on Classic. One of them made it all the way to 60, and one of them is most of the way there. But I eventually got bored and have not actually been playing. I've played it almost none at this in the last few weeks, say.
All right. One of our users has a question. If you could unmute yourself to ask him, that would.
Hello. What are your thoughts and opinions on the current femicide going on in Mexico?
I'm afraid I know nothing about the current femicide in modern Mexico, so I have no thoughts and opinion. What is happening? That is, I assume femicide means a lot of women are being killed, but I do not know in what context that is. Would you like to explain it? Because I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, so women are being targeted for hate crimes and being murdered pretty often, and the Mexico government is trying to cover it up as of now.
That may, for all I know, be true. I don't know. I don't know if it's true. I'm not sure you know if it's true. That in general, one of my rules of thumb for historical anecdotes is that one should distrust any anecdote that makes a good enough story to survive on its literary merits, because it might be real or it might be somebody's guess that got transmuted into a fact by repetition. The same thing applies to any story that fits some people's political beliefs. It might be true, but it could get propagated if it's not true. I think one sees a fair number of examples of that. So I guess I would have said that the first thing you do would be to see what the actual evidence is. Is there, can you get mortality figures for men and women? If the claim is that the government is covering it up, then how do you know it's happening? So anyway, but the real answer to your question is, since I know nothing about the subject, I have no opinion about it.
Jason, can I continue to answer some of the questions he asked?
Sure.
I live in Mexico. Many women near me have died due to this. It's targeted hate crimes. That's what they're trying to figure out why exactly. Over 1,000 women have died due to the targeted hate crimes, and that's all I know of.
Right. This is 1,000 women in Mexico, or 1,000 women in the area you know about?
1,000 women in Mexico as a whole over the past year.
Huh. And do you know how, when you say have died due to hate crime, you mean these are women who were murdered?
Yes.
How many men have been murdered in Mexico over that period?
Well, we're trying to figure out targeted, as in they're killing them because they're women.
How do you know they're killing them because they're women?
Signs of rape, like stalking and stuff like that.
And,
I'll get an article right.
Yeah, that is, as I say, this really is something I know nothing about. And 1,000 women sounds like a lot of people. On the other hand, Mexico is a pretty big country, and I wouldn't be astonished if more than 1,000 men were killed each year as well. And, if all you're saying is that men sometimes rape and kill women, that's clearly true, and it's very unfortunate, but I don't know. You're implying something sort of much more than the normal level of that kind of crime occurring.
All right. I guess we'll move on to
our thoughts on anime. I have no thoughts on anime. I haven't watched it. I do not currently play any computer games other than World of Warcraft, and play that very rarely. Just looking at questions on here. Next.
All right. So, do you believe that intellectual property would exist in a polycentric legal order?
That's a very interesting question. And I actually do discuss that again in the chapters for the 3rd edition of Machinery. And the answer is that in the system that I've described, you will get a less than optimal level of intellectual property. Whether that means none at all, I don't know. But, very good. Thank you for the article. Just a minute. Is there a link there? Yes. No. Open original. Just a minute. I'm just trying to take a look at. I want to go there, but I assume I'm not leaving where I am as well. Very good. All right. So that's just the image, though. Sorry. Images are all very well, but the image isn't what I want. What I want is sorry, brief interruption, because I'm trying to figure out, since this lady nicely sent me.
I sent an article.
Yes, I'm
sorry.
When I clicked on it, I was just getting the image, but I think I was clicking in the wrong place. I think this I think will do it. Yes, I now have the article, so I will be able to read that, but I'm not going to do that now because people have questions for me. Thank you. Now, what was the next one?
I believe you're in the middle of answering about intellectual property in a polycentric legal order.
You're right, intellectual property. The answer, I have a discussion in third edition of Machinery of what I refer to as market failure in the market for law. That the sort of basic argument I sketch in Machinery originally is that if the net effect of a legal rule is to make people better off, it's likely to come into existence on the market. If it's not to make people better off, it won't. And I have a discussion of why I think that's true. And then there are exceptions to that. Just as on ordinary markets, there are forms of market failure in ordinary markets where situations are worth producing but don't get produced, or not worth producing, things are worth producing and don't get produced, or the other way around. And in the case of the market for law in an anarcho-capitalist system, the problem is that a legal rule enforcing copyright between me and you produces benefits and costs for us, but it also produces benefits for people who are not customers of either my rights enforcement agency or your rights enforcement agency, since it will result in my writing more books and those people can read them. And the result is that the level of intellectual property that the agencies will agree to is lower than the level that would maximize total benefits. And if you want to go through details, go look at that chapter on market failure in the market for law, which I think is what I call it on Machinery. And therefore you would have a lower level than one ought to have, but I don't know what level you ought to have. It may be that the optimists have no intellectual property. There's a book called Against Intellectual Monopoly, which argues that both patent and copyright laws should be abolished. If they're right, then less than optimal means no, because optimal means no. But it is clear there are arguments for intellectual property as well as against. So I can't really say what the outcome would be, except that it would be lower than it ought to be.
All right. Do you have any thoughts on the left market anarchist organization Center for a Stateless Society?
I don't think I know enough about them. I have thoughts with particular people who I've argued with and who think of themselves as, I don't know if they think of them as left anarchists. I've had arguments with the Bleeding Heart Libertarians, and in fact, if people are sufficiently curious, my current project is writing a book or books based on material on my blog over the last 15 years. And I've webbed the drafts of those on my website, and you can find them if you look through the website for the link. And that includes a series where I was arguing with a couple of the Bleeding Heart Libertarian people who I thought were making poor arguments, and some discussion of left libertarianism in general. But as I think I mentioned in response earlier, of that set of things, the one that I think most interesting really is geo-libertarianism, Georgism, single taxism, because that's got an actual coherent, fairly clear coherent argument behind it. And I'm not sure that any of the others have as good a set of arguments. It's not one that convinces me, but it's one that I like, that I enjoy arguing with. But I'm afraid I haven't followed C4SS closely enough to have an opinion on them as an organization.
All right. Lemai Zuck asks, do you think that religion and anarcho-capitalism would be able to coexist? And would religious ideals go against the ideas of anarcho-capitalism?
I don't see any reason why religion couldn't exist in anarcho-capitalism. Whether the ideals of religion go against anarcho-capitalism will depend on the particular religion. My guess is that there are versions of Christianity or of Islam or of Judaism that are consistent with an anarcho-capitalist society, and versions that aren't.
All right. What are your thoughts on Ayn Rand?
She was brilliant, courageous, arrogant, and I think philosophically wrong. And again, if you look in the third edition of Machinery, I think it's in the third edition. That's in the third edition. It may also be in the second edition. I don't remember where that chapter is, but I spend a chapter to show on the argument on why I think her philosophical position is wrong. And the critical point of her philosophical position is that she claims, in effect, to have solved Hume's is-ought problem, to be able to show you rationally what moral beliefs one ought to hold. And I don't think she does. And I think I, at least to my satisfactory, demonstrate that she doesn't. That she doesn't. But she was a very odd writer, but she wrote very successful books. As I say, she was clearly courageous. I think her, in my theory at least, is that her fundamental problem was that she grew up with nobody equally smart around her, and therefore early came to the conclusion that when people disagreed with her, it was because they weren't smart enough to understand her ideas. And she maintained that position when it was no longer true because she was interacting with people, some of whom were smart. And that's where the arrogance comes from. But at the same time, she was an impressive human being.
All right. Do you believe that libertarian socialism is an oxymoron?
The problem with that is that socialism means so many different things. So suppose somebody said, my ideal society is one in which instead of having corporations, we have workers' co-ops, which are something that some socialists are in favor of. And I then ask him the question, which I put to a socialist who I debated not that long ago, if I start a non-workers co-op, an ordinary firm, and people are willing to work for me on the terms I offer, am I allowed to do that? And his answer was no. That's not libertarian socialism. But if his answer was yes, it would be libertarian socialism. That is, if what he's saying is he's willing to live with a free market system, he just thinks that the right way of organizing it is workers' co-ops, and he thinks that almost everybody will choose to do that, and he'll try to persuade them. That's consistent with libertarian society. So if that's what you mean by libertarian socialism, it's not an oxymoron. If what you mean is the government makes decisions and controls things, then it is.
All right. Sivan has a question. If you could unmute yourself to ask it, that'd be nice. You may have to leave to join back. Oh.
Hello, Dr. Friedman. It is very nice to be able to meet you. I have a question for you, sir. You have previously described medieval Iceland as very similar to or anarcho-capitalist-esque society. Can you give any other real-life examples of societies similar?
First, I've usually described Saga period Iceland as a semi-stateless society.
Yeah, I mean,
because it had some of the features of anarcho-capitalism, but not all of them. But the answer is yes. Somaliland, northern Somalia, prior to the creation of the country of Somalia, was essentially a relatively primitive version of an anarcho-capitalist system. To some degree, the Romani, although they're existing generally within places where there's a government, they have largely succeeded in sort of staying below the radar. Less I think now, as governments get better at things like record keeping, and enforced their rules by private mechanisms of different sorts. So my most recent published book is one called Legal Systems Very Different from Ours. And that one, I discuss a number of stateless societies, including the Somali, the Romani in the sense in which they're stateless, and the Icelandic one. And I think those are all examples. I've also got a quote from I think, medieval historian suggesting that the actual legal mechanisms in a good deal of early medieval Europe were stateless in the sense that it was a feud system rather than a system in which people went to the royal courts, even though theoretically the king thought that the courts and the king's law controlled things. So let me see that one also is. I've got a late the book you have to pay to get, but I have a late draft that's on that's on the web. So if you'll give me just a moment, I can give you the link for that. There he is. Just a minute. Here we are.
Also, Dr. Friedman, sorry to interrupt, but I also want to say some people also consider the city-states of Europe to be near anarcho-capitalist, not the contemporary city-states, but you know the city-states of the HRE, the Holy Roman Empire. So, would you agree with that statement that
I
they
don't
were
know. I'm
similar
sorry. I
to?
don't know. I don't know enough about those systems. So my guess would be not, but I could easily be wrong. But
I also want to ask
anyway,
a
I
personal
just want to
question.
point out that I've just put up the link to a late draft of my legal systems book. So if you want at least my account of the Somali, Icelandic, Romani, to some extent Irish, though it's much harder to figure out how the Irish system worked. They're all there. Next.
And I also want to ask a personal question.
Sure.
What is your favorite kind of pizza to eat?
I don't think I really have a favorite kind of pizza.
Or the most common one that you? It's a
I
common
don't eat
word.
pizza very often, mostly because I generally am worried about my weight. And at the moment, for various complicated reasons, I'm trying to hold down my glycemic load as well. So pizza is not very good for me. But things I like on pizza, I like anchovies on pizza. That's one thing that certain members of my family disagree about. So when we get a pizza, we've got to have it only partly with anchovies. My wife agrees about that, fortunately, but my adult children who live with me don't. I like onions. I like sausage. I guess those would be some of the obvious things. But I don't have a single standard pizza that I order on the rare occasions when I get pizza. Why do I specify adult children, somebody wants to know? Because they are my children in the biological sense of being the offspring of me and my wife. And one of them is over 30 and the other is, I think, in his late 20s at this point. So that's why I would refer to them as my adult children, in order to specify that they are adults and their relationship to me as being my children.
Perfect. The next question is by Red Blood Black Flag, and he asks, what are your thoughts on voluntary slavery and Larken Rose thesis that authority is a myth and or self-contradictory?
Yeah, I don't know. Since I haven't read Larkin's stuff on authority, I don't even know what he means by that. That is, authority might mean the moral right to command other people, or it might mean the ability to command other people by being able to punish them if they don't obey you. Clearly, the latter exists in lots of contexts, usually, unfortunately. Voluntary slavery, I guess, like most of these, there isn't a simple answer. There are circumstances where the opportunity for voluntary slavery has good effects. And the particular case I'm thinking about was indentured servitude as a way of paying for immigration to America. That in the 18th and I think the early 19th century, one of the ways in which people who couldn't afford the cost of migrating to the U.S. could do it was to make a contract with a ship captain where the cost was a certain number of dollars. And the deal was that when the ship got to America, the captain got to auction off the person's service in a reverse auction. That is to say, the question is, who will pay the cost of his fare for the shortest number of years of service? And that really was a form of voluntary slavery. It was one the people in question had agreed to. And the result of that was people were able to get to America who otherwise couldn't get to it. And that seems to me a desirable thing.
All right. How do you feel about the Dark Enlightenment?
I don't think I know enough about it to feel. That is, in general, I'm not even sure what is included in that. This is, what's his name? There's a Curtis Yarvin, he's got a name online. And I read Slate Star Codex and now read later things by Scott Alexander, and he does quite a nice job of first explaining what he sees as the sort of what's the right term? not neo-right, but whatever they're. Sorry, I'm blocking on the terms people are using for themselves. Mhm. But he first sort of gives what looks like a sympathetic summary of their views, and then later had a later post in which he offers arguments to think that they're wrong. And I found that convincing, but I haven't really argued with these people, so I'm not in a position to know whether there's any sense in what they say or not. Somebody wants to know what is my opinion of Michael Huemer. Very high. Michael is probably, of sort of other libertarian academics, he's probably the one I have the highest opinion of, although of course many of them I don't know well enough to have an opinion of. He's very bright. I read his book on intuitionism because it was his philosophical position is about the same as mine. I was hoping he could do a better job than I could of defending it against the most persuasive attacks, and I don't think he could, although he thought he could. He's a good speaker. He's a nice guy. So yeah, my opinion of Michael Huemer is entirely positive.
Okay, so Judas has a question. I'm going to have him ask it in VC himself. Judas, you may have to leave the call and join back to ask.
What are my thoughts on the GIF of which seems to be saying, my father's saying bullshit? I don't believe it. It does not sound to me like something he has any chance of saying. So maybe it's somebody else's comment on him, and then it's not very interesting. I have no opinions on the temporary hentai.
All right, Judas, could you ask your question?
Can I be heard? Can I be heard? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. My question is, if you had to make an argument in favour of the Labour theory of value, what would the argument be? And if you were to believe the LTV were to be true, would you still believe that then that makes a worker-employee relationship inherently exploitative?
The problem here is that the labor theory of value describes a whole lot of different things. That Adam Smith has, by my count, 3 different labor theories of value. If the claim is that the only source of value is labor, then I would say that that's clearly false. Then in particular, capital is actually productive. That the willingness of somebody to put in inputs now for outputs a year from now results in your getting more output than if everybody insisted on getting the outputs when the inputs went in. So in that sense, it's wrong. And because it's wrong, the claim that the relation between an employer and an employee is inherently exploitative is wrong, because the employer, among other things, is producing capital, which is one of the productive elements. It's sometimes claimed that Adam Smith had a labor theory, that David Ricardo had a labor theory of value. But if you actually read Ricardo, you could just as easily describe it as a capital theory of value, because what's happening with Ricardo is that in order to essentially invent general equilibrium theory with no advanced mathematics at all, he makes simplifying assumptions, and the key assumption is that the capital labor ratio in all goods is the same. And if the capital labor ratio in all goods is the same, then it is equally true that the price of a good is proportional to the labor input and proportional to the capital input.
All right. How do you feel about modern monetary theory?
I'm afraid I don't know enough about it to really have an opinion. I say I don't do macro.
All right. Okay, then how do you feel about feudalism?
This again gets partly into the question of what you mean by feudalism. That, to me at least, the essential feature of feudalism is that the key input is controlled at a low enough level so that the ruler is a coalition leader rather than a dictator. And in medieval Europe, the key input was heavy cavalry, knights and knight-like warriors, as it were. That was owned far enough down the chain so that the lords commanded considerably larger armies than the king did, and therefore the king was necessarily a coalition leader. as I interpret it, the political city machines of America in the sort of late 19th, early 20th century were also feudal systems. Only the key input was votes. The votes were controlled by the local political leadership. Hence, the mayor or the head of the whatever the relevant party was really a coalition leader. And I think that's a form of political organization that shows up under some circumstances, is functional under some circumstances, and not under others.
All right. How do you feel that false advertising should be dealt with?
Under some circumstances, it's fraudulent. But on the other hand, it's often very hard to know what is true or to prove what is true or false. So the main reason I think it gets dealt with is that people don't believe it.
All right. Looking for another question right now. How about who will build the roads?
Presumably roads will be built by private people, either directly charging for them, which is getting much easier with modern technology because you can have devices in the car that we do. I mean, people are doing automated toll collection now, or you can do it with indirect payoffs, such as the system where you build a road and you then sell property along that road to people who want customers. I think there was a road built that way in Texas sometime in the last few decades. So I don't really see that there's any special problem with who will build the roads.
All right. What are your thoughts on healthcare in an economy?
The U.S. prior to Obamacare, I believe about half of all healthcare expenditure was by the government. So we have not had a market system for a very long time, and the private half is heavily regulated. And what I am in favor of course, is an entirely free market system in which people can have insurance if they wish, and the insurance companies can sell customers what customers want to buy, and not required to provide what they don't want to buy.
All right. What is your relationship with Thomas Sowell?
I don't really have a relationship. I mean, I'm sure I've met him, but I don't know if he'd recognize me. I certainly don't know him in any serious sense. I've read all of one of his books, Immigrant America, I think it was called, and it was very interesting. He's obviously a very bright, impressively bright person. I started another one of his books, and it seemed to be convincing, but I found its thesis depressing, and so I never finished it. And I think I may have also read his non-political book, his book on choosing a college, which is, I think, still useful if you're looking at colleges, because most books for people looking at colleges are trying to, are summaries of information on existing colleges. And what his book is really about is how should you figure out what's the right college for you? And I think he wrote it after his son, I think, was looking for a college. And that's quite neat. So no, my opinion of Sowell is entirely positive, but he's written a lot, most of which I haven't read, so I'm sure there is something he's written at some point I would disagree with, but I don't know what.
All right. How do you feel about the American Individualist-Anarchists like Benjamin Tucker and Lysander Spooner?
Spooner is a lot of fun, and I enjoy his writing. I am not at all sure. My general argumentative strategy is for consequentialist rather than moral arguments. But if you want moral arguments, No Treason is certainly a neat book. I haven't read enough of those people. My impression is that some of them have mildly weird economics, that some of them seem to think that the natural interest rate is zero, which is not, as far as I can tell, the case. But I've never really gotten into a detailed examination of their writings to know what I would disagree with.
All right. How do you feel about Ludwig von Mises?
Clearly a good and important economist, not, of course, an anarchist. Indeed, a little less anarchist than my father, I would say, given his view on state opera and the draft. But again, I've never actually read through all of Human Action. I've looked at a little bit of it. His Human Action as Purpose of Behavior is pretty close to my definition of economics, namely that approach to understanding behavior that assumes that individuals have objectives and tend to take the actions that achieve them. So I guess insofar as I have an opinion of Mises, it's positive. I've never actually read through the literature of the calculation controversy. I've seen lots of stuff about it, but Coase, I think, correctly pointed out that the strong version of the calculation controversy, the claim that a socialist planned economy not only can't work well, but can't work at all, has to be wrong, because if it was right, there'd be no corporations. That a corporation, after all, is a small-scale planned economy inside it, and nonetheless functions. And that's sort of one of the points of Coase's essay, The Theory of the Firm. That's what it's called. But I think it's clear that the problems with a centrally planned economy that you pointed out are indeed real problems, and I don't think they were ever adequately dealt with by the other side of that argument.
All right. Do you consider yourself a utilitarian or just a consequentialist?
I'm neither a utilitarian nor a consequentialist. As I like to point out to people, if you look up utilitarian in the Index of Machinery of Freedom, the entry is for utilitarian, why I am not. I think makes sense to make consequentialist arguments. And my basic position is, if you want to, in principle, you can't reach conclusions without some moral assumptions. On the other hand, empirically, people's moral beliefs have a lot in common. There are very few people that think it is a good thing for people to be poor, or a good thing for people to be sick or ignorant, or think it's morally worthy to torture children. That I believe that the kind of institutions I'm in favor of, free market institutions, are enough better than the alternatives, so that in terms of almost all the moral beliefs actual people hold, they are preferable. And if that's right, I don't have to try to persuade people of my moral beliefs in order to persuade them to agree with my political views, because if I can persuade them of my consequentialist beliefs, of what the consequences of the institutions will be, that's enough to convince them. And that's a good thing, because I don't have really good arguments for my moral beliefs, and therefore I do not, I don't want to try to have to persuade people that they're correct. So I'm in favor of consequentialist arguments, but there are certainly circumstances certainly I'm not utilitarian in that there are circumstances in which I am not in favor of making a decision that increases utility, and I discussed that in Machinery of Freedom as well. And I don't think I'm even a consequentialist in that sense.
All right, 7D, could you ask Zohias' question?
Of course. Zohias asks, assuming colonization of and migration to space becomes possible at some point, how would you theorize that private property would develop or be handled in space? And have you read Walter Block's book on the subject called Space Capitalism, How Humans Will Colonize Planets, Moons, and Asteroids?
I have not read that book of Walter's, but it is a question I have thought about. I think I may have even discussed it in print somewhere, or maybe in talks. And the fundamental question is, what does one own? And that depends a whole lot on technology. So if you imagine a really advanced future technology where we're approaching the sort of Dyson sphere point, then one of the critical things to own is solid angle on the sun. And it would then make sense to have some legal rules for determining who owns that. But of course, the one question is, what are the things that are valuable, and the other is, what are the things for which it's possible to enforce property rights, for which you can observe whether or not people are trespassing, for which it's possible to define property. It's pretty hard to do that with cubics, with space by itself, since it doesn't have a natural set of grids over it, as it were. In the short term, I would expect that you would have property rights in space habitats, which are physical objects built by people. I suppose you may, for working at roughly our present level of technology, you may want property rights in geosynchronous orbits, since I gather geosync is getting crowded at this point. There may be other non-physical objects that you would want eventually to have property rights in. Asteroids. One of the questions is: do you claim an asteroid by just going there? Do you claim an asteroid by getting the information that tells you whether it's valuable and so forth? So no, I think how you do property rights in space is an interesting question, but it's going to depend a whole lot on what the technologies turn out to be.
All right. Hirohito asks, what is your opinion on Julius Evola's criticism of capitalism?
I have never read it, so I have no idea what it's like.
All right. Bilgeman Clintonian asks, do you think America is headed to high inflationary periods?
I don't know. The government has produced a lot of money, but as far as I can tell, what the Fed has been doing is borrowing it back by paying interest on reserves. But again, I don't do macro, and I don't know enough for me to have an opinion on whether it's going to have the result you might expect of eventually causing inflation or not.
All right. Have you invested in crypto or gold?
I have not invested in gold, other than tiny amounts that I use for jewelry making, which is one of my many hobbies. I have some Bitcoin, but I wouldn't quite say I invested in Bitcoin. A good many years ago, as you may know, there's an event called Pork Fest that the Free State Project in New Hampshire has every summer. And some years ago, I gave a talk there, and they had agreed to pay my expenses. And they offered to pay my expenses in Bitcoin. And I thought that would be neat, because Bitcoin is neat. So the result is that I ended up with some Bitcoin. And I suppose if you consider the present value of Bitcoin, that my talks at Pork Fest must be the highest paid talks I've ever given. Not, of course, in terms of what I got at the time, but in terms of its present value. But all I've done is to hold those Bitcoin because I did not see any particular reason to speculate on it. I just thought it was interesting stuff.
All right. How do you feel about
what I think is this tragedy is that it distracts to have a silly and uninteresting video shown over and over again, since you asked.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so how do you feel about seasteading?
That it's a very clever idea. It probably won't work, but if it did work, it would do a lot of good.
Okay. Why do you think it probably wouldn't work?
Well, I guess the biggest problem is how do you protect yourself from any government that doesn't like what you're doing?
All right.
Seastead is going to be very vulnerable.
Okay, then, because I'm having a little trouble finding another question right now, what's your favorite type of sandwich?
I don't think I have a favorite type of sandwich there. I like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. On the whole, I would rather replace the jelly with slices of apple, which are better for me and crunchier than jelly and give a very similar effect.
All right. What are your thoughts on the book 1984?
What are my thoughts on the book? It's a depressing book, of course. I find Orwell's nonfiction letters and essays much more interesting than his fiction, and also more enjoyable to read. There's a, I think, 4-volume collection of Orwell's letters and essays, which I have read at least once and probably more than once, which I find very interesting, both for the ideas and for the picture it gives of English society a little before and after World War and during World War II. But I think I only read 1984 once, and I didn't feel inclined to read it again. I have not read Kaczynski's manifesto.
Okay, 7D, could you read Repact's question?
Of course. Repact asks, how would you defend the argument that the government shouldn't get involved in any environmental regulations, especially when we're talking about climate change? The typical counter they use is that we need to regulate CO2 emissions, otherwise the sea level will rise too much, so some countries will have floods. And also concerning nitrogen, they say that it's bad for the biodiversity, and therefore there should be regulations.
Yeah, I guess I said earlier that to some extent environmentalism had replaced socialism as the argument for government regulation. And the problem with that is that there's no good reason to expect governments on the grounds of environmentalism to actually do good things. So, for example, one of the things the government does to prevent global warming is to contribute to world hunger. That is, the U.S. government, I don't remember the numbers exactly, but I think it's converting something like 10% of the world's output of maize, corn, into alcohol, which means pushing up the price of maize, which means making eating more expensive for poor people. The opinion for quite a while of people of environmentalists who look at it is that turning corn into alcohol does not in fact reduce CO2, because growing that corn requires tractors and various and trucks to haul it around and so forth, all of which are burning fuel and therefore producing CO2. So I think that in general, the government cannot be trusted to make the correct decisions on environmental issues. In the particular case of climate change, it is not at all clear to me that climate change is a bad thing. It's clear that we'll have some negative and some positive effects. The sea level rise, I think, is very much a sort of tempest in a teapot, that if you actually look at the scale of it, it's tiny. That sea level, when I last looked at, I think the most recent was still the most recent, I think, IPCC report, the high end of the high emission scenario projection for the end of the century was about 1 meter of sea level rise. That's about half the distance between high tide and low tide in most places. I came across a figure for the U.S. southeast coast, that is the South Atlantic coast of the U.S., that on average, a foot of sea level rise shifts the coastline by about 100 feet. So very roughly speaking, the effect of the sea level rise by the end of the century will be to move the coast by about 100 meters. That's a small fraction of a mile. That's invisible on any map except a very, very, very large-scale map. So I think sea level rise is not really a serious issue. There are serious issues, though, one of which is the effect of CO2 on the pH of the ocean. And I don't think we have a very clear idea of how large those effects are. And one of it is the effect on those organisms that can't shift their range very easily, such as trees, because I don't think there's any reason to think that the present climate is better than the climate that we'll have in 100 years, but it's different. So anyway, that could be a long argument. And you can find stuff on my blog in which I discuss climate issues. But I think that that with climate today, as with population 50 years ago, you have a change which has good and bad effects. People make a big thing of adding up all the bad effects and saying how terrible it is and ignoring the good effects. And there's no particular reason in either case to think that the net effects are bad, though they could be. I do not consider myself either homophobic or transphobic. I would have to say that those people who've transitioned from one gender to another who aren't believably of their new gender, I find somewhat uncomfortable. On the other hand, I don't have any particular problem either with people who I don't have any particular problem with people who have convincingly done so. I have no particular objection to homosexuals. I don't particularly want to have sex with male homosexuals because that isn't what attracts me. But there's no reason why they shouldn't have sex with each other. My rather casual impression is that lesbian couples work as parents a good deal better than male homosexual couples work, since I think women on the whole tend to be somewhat better at bringing up kids than men are. But no, I don't think I would describe either. Do I have a favorite news source, think tank to read, or any recommendations? I spent a lot of time reading Slate Star Codex before it closed down, and I now sometimes read ACX, Astro Codex 10, which is Scott Alexander's new blog, or whatever you call it. But I also read Data Secrets Locks, which is what my wife refers to as the Refugees Forum, which is where a lot of the Slate Star Codex commenters went when Slate Star Codex closed down. I assume some of you know that story and some of you don't, so no particular reason to talk about it. Let me see if I can think of any more of that. Oh, other than news sources, I use Google News as my news source because it shows me stuff from lots of different sources. But I don't really know a reliable news source in the sense of a newspaper I actually trust. I think most people who have the experience of reading news media coverage of something they know a lot about end up not trusting the news media, because for most media, the incentive is to tell a story people will want to read, not to make sure that what they say is true.
All right. 7D had a question. 7D, if you could ask your question.
So I was wondering, within quasi-totalitarian societies, such as those illustrated within V for Vendetta by Alan Moore or George Orwell's 1984, I was wondering to what extent civil disobedience creates positive change within society.
I don't know. That is, I think that's too general a question. I think that the obvious problem with civil disobedience is they'll lock you up, or maybe hang you, so there might be circumstances in which you can be which you're somehow reasonably sure that everybody else agrees with you that it's a terrible system, and you can all show that. But anyway, so yeah, I don't know a good. So I think the best solution to totalitarian societies is to get out of them, emigrate. That has the virtue that you can do it yourself.
All right. Have you read Christopher Chase Rachels, and do you have any opinions on him?
Nope. Christopher Chase Rachels? Is that the author, or is that the author in the book?
That is the author.
What is that? I've never heard of.
He's an Austrian economist, anarcho-capitalist theorist. He goes by radical capitalist.
Huh. I'm afraid I don't recognize that, so I don't have an opinion on it.
All right. So then, how do you feel about Ted Kaczynski's cases?
That is, I have not read his manifesto. He clearly was doing bad things. On the other hand, he was at least following out the logic of his position. Somebody wants to know how I feel about open borders. I'm in favor of open borders, but I am also in favor of not having the people who come across the open border have access to welfare payments. And ideally, I think in a ideal system, they would not get welfare and would be charged lower taxes in order to make up for the fact they're not getting one of the things the taxes pay for.
All right. Sunshine has a question. They say that they think a lot about chaos theory and chaos mathematics, even though they're not an expert. What do you think about the concept of chaos, and what do you think about the idea that, in this context, anarchism is chaos.
Not a set of ideas I've thought about, I'm afraid.
All right. Are you culturally more conservative or progressive?
Huh. That's very tricky. On the one hand, I think that probably for most people, a standard monogamous marriage is the sensible pattern. I have no moral objection to polyamory, polygamy, polygyny, polyandry, any of that stuff. I have no moral objection to people spending all their life on casual sex, but my guess is that none of those things work as well as a conventional monogamous marriage for most people. So in that sense, I guess I'm culturally conservative. On the other hand, I often find that left-wing towns feel comfortable in the sense that there are bookstores and stuff of that sort. Sort of hard trying to think of what are the other things. I'm an atheist, so I guess that counts as culturally left. On the other hand, I am not particularly hostile to religion. Several of my favorite authors were serious Christians. G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis, I think highly of. Probably especially Chesterton, who was really neat, who was really a libertarian, although somewhat nutty libertarian, like many of us. And so I guess I'm on the one hand sympathetic to the conservative religious position, but don't agree with it. Not sure if that's enough of an answer, but I think that's it. But my thoughts on argumentation ethics, you can find a piece I wrote on the subject for Liberty Magazine, which is on the libertarian section of my webpage. And as far as I could tell, the argumentation ethics was complete nonsense, as I think I demonstrated in a fairly short essay.
All right. We may have to cut this off soon. We're quite quickly running out of questions, and we've been going on for nearly 2 hours now, so we do have a couple questions from Zohias that Zevan D is going to ask you, then we may have to end this.
That's fine.
Of course. May I have a link to the question in mind?
Oh, I thought you had it. All right. Okay, there. It's Zohias pinged you with it.
Nobody sent me anything. Perfect. Assuming colonization of that, dude, we already asked that.
Yeah, he's already. Wasn't there another one? All right, let's go with Dad praises Jesus' question. How do you feel about the Confederate States of America?
Well, I think they ended up being about as unfree, slavery aside, as the Union. That is to say that they did not, in fact, respect individual rights, even of white people, very well. They existed. I guess the one thing I think they were right about was secession, but they were seceding for undefensible reasons, so to speak. That is, in order to preserve slavery, which was a bad system.
All right. Can we?
Perfect.
Jason, can I ask my question?
I've now been given the questions.
All right. 7D, continue on with the questions.
Alrighty. Zohias asks, what are your views on world federalism, and do you think a global federal state would lead to a flourishing of free trade and economic interdependence?
I think it's a terrible idea because I think in general large governments work somewhat worse than small governments, and that one of the things that keeps the world from being a good deal worse than it could be is the fact that if governments really mess up, they look bad compared to other governments, and to some extent people are free to leave, or companies are free to leave. And once you have a world government of some sort, whether or not you call it a federal government, we have some experience in the U.S. case of a federal system in which theoretically the federal government was very small. If you look at 19th century taxation in the U.S. of federal, state, and local, the smallest of the three was federal. And yet we've ended up with a system dominated by the federal government. I think the same thing is likely to happen with a world federalism, and you then have a world where there's nowhere to escape to. would be terrible.
All right.
Okay, we got another question by Zohias asking, do you think that governments should transition away from primarily taxing income and tax based on consumption instead of as the normal sales retail tax?
I have no particular opinion on the arguments against on various forms of taxation. It's not the sort of thing I've thought very much about or I'm very interested in. So is that a final question?
I suppose we can get a couple more questions. So, how do you feel about distributism?
About distributism? You mean Chesterton's distributism?
I believe so.
Yeah. It was an interesting, unsuccessful attempt to start a new economic system. And as I say, I think Chesterton himself was a libertarian. I'm not sure that all of his fellow distributists were. I think the argument for it probably made more sense in the UK than it would in the US, since at least Chesterton was arguing that a lot of the land had actually been stolen by the crown back under the Tudors. I'm not sure if it's true. I don't know enough about the history, but it certainly isn't true here. So, no, it was an interesting attempt, but I don't think it's one that I don't think it would give an ideal society, and in particular, it seems to assume that everything ought to be small scale. That's probably not true. Anything else?
All right. We have one last question, then we'll have to cut
I
it off.
believe Carter has a question.
Oh,
No, it was me. Rude. 7018. Okay. What do you think about the new generation, like Gen Z?
Insufficient data. I think that my grandson is great, and he's 15, so I guess he counts as the new generation.
What's his number?
What's his number? Oh, you want to call him up?
uh,
But I spend an hour Skyping with him every Sunday, and some of the people I interview for. I'm a Harvard alumnus, and so I interview Harvard applicants who are in my area, and some of them are really neat people. But both of those are a tiny and non-random sample of the generation, and so I don't really think I'm competent to have an opinion on the generation.
all right. It seems we're gonna have to end it here.
All right.
I hope
Thank you.
everyone enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it,
It was
Dr.
fine.
Friedman.
I like hearing my own voice, like many people. Bye-bye.
All right. Have a good one.
Thank you, bye.